All right. Unifying principles of anatomy and physiology. Cell theory. All structure and function results from the activity of cells. Evolution. The body is a product of evolution. We're molded by years of natural selection. Unity of form and function. Physiology cannot be separated from anatomy. Hierarchy of structure, in that our structures become more complex as they get larger. And homeostasis. We maintain stable conditions within the body. They're very diverse forms and common challenges. Animals inhabit every part of the biosphere, and form and function are very closely related within those animals and species that exist in cold climates, warm climates, water, air, on land. Anatomy is, of course, the study of structure, and physiology, the study of functions. And physical laws and environment constrain animal size and shape just as they constrain the shape and size of our cells and tissue, and of human beings for that matter. This is a very small animal. This is a tiny little shrew. It's a rodent. It is that small, fits into the palm of your hand. But as you can imagine, it has a huge surface area relative to its volume, so it loses heat. So that's one thing, that if there's a lot of surface area, then you tend to lose heat. And this little animal has to eat its body weight of food every day in order to maintain its heat. So ability to form actions depends on the animal's shape and size. And there's evolutionary convergence that reflects different species adaptations to similar environmental challenges. So things like, for example, these are different kinds of animals. We have fish, tuna, a shark is a fish, a penguin is a bird. Its wings are adapted to swim. The dolphin is a mammal and the seal is a mammal. But you'll notice one thing about their body plan, and that is that they're all elongated to displace water easily, and so that there isn't a pull of eddying water behind them as they swim. So they all have that kind of torpedo shape that's conducive to swimming through water without expending a lot of energy. And in each case, these animals have evolved down different evolutionary lines, yet because of their environment, they have the same types of shapes. So the size and shape directly affects how we exchange energy and materials with the surroundings. So life evolved in water. As such, all of the materials that all of our cells need must come from water. Our cells are formed in such a way to operate in water. And let me just show you how that occurred. From very simple organisms like single-celled protists, which are a eukaryote. Something like an amoeba. This is a single cell, it has a nucleus, and it just exchanges material by simple diffusion. Well, all of the cells in our body have to exchange materials in the same way. When cells came together and formed colonies and eventually multicellular animals, well, cells started to take on functions. So these cells out here are diffusion cells. These cells are also diffusion cells, but these cells diffuse oxygen, carbon dioxide. These cells tend to diffuse food that's been trapped in this gastrovascular cavity, but they don't have a cardiovascular system. Instead, all of the cells have to be in contact with both the water on the outside or with the gastrointestinal cavity. That's the only way they can get materials in and out of all the cells. But you and I are multicellular organisms. We have a sac-like body plan. In other words, we're a tube within a tube, and we also have a cavity that holds all of our organs. But in order to get all of the materials we require for the trillions of cells in our body, we have to be able to transport materials. And we have to have specialized body structures to diffuse carbon dioxide and oxygen with the atmosphere, and to diffuse nutrients into our cells and deliver to our body, and also excrete waste. So we're very, very specialized in that way. But that means, since we have a large body, we have comparatively, you know, the hydra, that little animal, you look at, it's very tiny, you can hardly see it. We have large bodies with loads of cells. So one theme that you'll see come up over and over again is that our surface areas are increased everywhere. So, and how does it do that? How does our body do that? Well, here, for example, is the lining of the small intestine. And we looked at columnar cells in the cell division, but these are called villi. They extend into the lumen. Lumen is the word giving for the inside of a tube. They extend into the lumen of the intestines, and each one of these villi is aligned with columnar cells, increasing the surface area enormously. In the lungs, there are cells called, structures rather, called alveoli, teeny little sacs. But if you were to spread those surface area of all those sacs out, it would cover a tennis court. So the surface area of the lungs is largely to get as much nutrient and or gases into the body as we can. I have a question. The terms villi and microvilli. No, that's a very good question. The villi are extensions of tissue. The microvilli are extensions of each individual cell. Good question, yeah. And in order to deliver nutrients from the intestines to all of the cells of the body, and gases like oxygen from the lungs, we have a cardiovascular system, a blood system. So that includes the heart, of course, that pumps the blood to the body. It goes past the lungs, picks up the oxygen, delivers it to everybody else that requires it, and then picks up carbon dioxide from the body, goes and delivers it to the lungs for expulsion. Yeah. The tube within a tube is, of course, the digestive tube, gastrointestinal cavity, or gastrointestinal tract, the GI tract is sometimes known as, which delivers nutrients just through diffusion to the blood. The kidneys, that's another area where your blood is being cleaned of toxins. And as such, there are thousands and thousands of tiny little tubules called nephridia. And they clean your blood through various processes like osmosis and diffusion. An enormous amount per day. No tissue, however, operates entirely alone. For example, in an organ, many tissues operate for the function of that organ. For example, those columnar cells we were looking at lining the villi, here are the villi. They're epithelial cells. But they can't just float loosey-goosey. They have to be anchored in some way. They're anchored. And plus, by the way, epithelial tissue doesn't have any blood vessels flowing through it. Blood vessels are absent. Rather, the source of blood vessels comes from submucosa. This is connective tissue. It's a different kind of tissue. And this happens to be fibers with lots of space between them, for blood vessels and also for macrophages that assist in immunity. Underneath that is another layer of tissue. This is muscle tissue, smooth muscle. The food, even by gravity, isn't going to go down the esophagus and through the intestines quickly enough. Instead, it's helped by smooth muscle, which contracts in a form known as peristalsis. There's circular muscle that squeezes, and there's longitudinal muscle that stretches, and the food moves down the intestines and the esophagus. So here's an example of the functional hierarchy of the skeleton. So we start with cells, they being the smallest living form. In this case, when we're talking about the skeleton, the cell is called an osteoblast. The type of tissue to which osteoblasts belong is called connective tissue. Tissues form organs, just like the stomach that we just looked at. In this case, the organ is a bone. The system is called the skeletal system. So here's the cell. Sorry, these are a bit off kilter. This is the tissue. This is a bone. This is the skeletal system. It includes long bones like this one, but also flat bones, bones for locomotion and bones for protection. And of course, all of the systems of the body work together for the function of the organism. In this case, it's Shrek. Or who played Shrek? Oh yeah, Mike Myers. What are tissues? There are four main types of tissue. Tissues, they are groups of cells with a common function. They work together. There are four types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So the four types of tissue. Histology is the study of tissue. Histology is the study of tissue. It's microscopic anatomy. So we look at tissue through a microscope, which you will start doing on Thursday. The main differences between these primary classes of tissue are the types of cells, the functions of those cells, the matrix. The matrix is something excreted by the cells. It's the surrounding area. What is it made of? And the amount of space between cells. So those are the main differences between our different kinds of tissue: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So where do these tissues arise in the first place? Well, you and I start off as a cell. We were all one cell called a zygote. I think that's the great equalizer of humanity. We all just started as one cell. That's the zygote. So that's the egg and sperm came together, the nuclei fused, they formed the zygote. Well, immediately the zygote starts to divide by a mitosis. Divide, divide, divide. Eventually, it forms a ball of cells, lots and lots of divisions. with a hollow center. Eventually, the cells start to differentiate. So differentiation when it comes to cells is a big deal because they differentiate into whatever they're going to be. So they differentiate into either a muscle cell or a fat cell or an epithelial cell. So they differentiate. The very first differentiation divides the cells into three classes. Three classes. I'm just going to draw this simply, okay? This is ectoderm. The outer layer of cells is already a little bit different from all the other cells. Mesoderm. In the middle. And I'll use blue for endoderm. Those are the very first differentiations of cells. So they form layers. So ectoderm, for example, forms the skin, so the outer layers. Epidermis, it forms epidermis cells and much of the nervous system, although not all. Mesoderm, meso means middle, forms muscle. Whoops, muscle. Hang on, let me spell that correctly. Forms muscle. It also forms bone, blood, and some of the other connective tissues. Endoderm, on the other hand, forms the mucous membrane lining of the body, of our cavities. The GI tract and the respiratory system. And digestive glands. So good. So I hope you're writing this down. I'm going to give you a little bit more to write. So how do we study tissue? We do that in the lab with a microscope. And we get different types of tissue sections. So when the specimen is prepared, it may be as a, like say you had, for example, a tube, like a blood vessel. You may get a longitudinal section, which will look something like that. You may, however, get a cross section, which will look like that, a cross section of that blood vessel, which will show the various kinds of tissue. Or you might even get an oblique section. So it's been cut at an angle, which means that it won't look round. It will look a more oval shape like that, an oblique section. So each of these sections show slightly different things. And that's something to be aware of when we're doing the histology lab. So epithelial tissue is a lining tissue. It covers the body. It lines our organs and cavities. They're very closely packed cells. And you'll see why. They cover surfaces, they line cavities and tubes of internal organs because they are largely functional in exchange with the environment. And also, for example, your skin cells, which are epithelial, they protect your body. They protect your body from pathogens and from water. So I just wanted to make some notes. We said this before, I'll just say it again. There's no room for blood vessels in epithelial tissue. They're too tightly packed together. So how does it get oxygen? It depends on underlying tissue for oxygen, for example. Epithelial tissue sits on a basement membrane, it's called. A basement membrane. It's just a basal surface of cells. So a surface of cells that can anchor to other cells. It consists of a thin layer of collagen and adhesive proteins. It basically functions to anchor that epithelial tissue to connective tissue. Are you with me so far? Good, okay, good. Awesome, awesome. So epithelial tissue, where do you find it in the body? The functions in particular are protection, secretion, and exchange. I'm going to make that a bit larger so you can see it better. Simple squamous epithelium, single layer, flattened cells. They have a basement membrane. They line, for example, the air sacs of the lungs. They also line blood vessels. And they are largely for exchange. We'll look at these all separately too, by the way. A simple cuboidal. As you can see, they're cube-shaped. They surround a lumen. Oops. Oh, I see why it's gone so large like that, because I've enlarged everything. Lumen, that's the interior of that tube. This is a tube in the kidney. Columnar epithelium, long and skinny, lining the intestines, for example. Did I miss anything? No, okay. Stratified squamous epithelium. So that's just stacks of cells. And the lower cells replace the upper cells. You'll find that, for example, lining the esophagus, because when you eat food, you lose a lot of those cells. And so the cells at the bottom, they just simply replace the cells that you've lost. And since they're lost with alarming frequency, not that alarming, but the cells in your gut, for example, are lost within 3 days or so, and they're replaced very rapidly. In some cases, the layers of cells are dead cells. So your skin, for example, is layers of dead cells. They're full of keratin. Underneath, here are the rapidly dividing epithelial cells. Simple squamous. Where do you find it? Lining the cardiovascular system, lines the air sacs of the lungs. They're leaky for gas exchange, very efficient diffusion and absorption. Found in the alveoli, those are the air sacs of the lungs, the glomeruli, in the kidneys, endothelium around blood vessels, so in this diagram, this is a blood vessel. It's a longitudinal section of a blood vessel. And what do you think these little red discoid shaped cells are inside the blood vessel? What are those cells? You can write in the chat. The small cells that are inside the blood vessel, what would they be? They're discoid shaped. Oh, good. I've got red blood cells and platelets. Yes, some of them will be platelets for sure, and many of them will be red blood cells. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. Very efficient diffusion. Simple cuboidal epithelium. They line secretory glands. There's lots of cytoplasm. They often have microvilli as well. They are functioning in absorption and excretion. And they often produce mucus. You will find simple cuboidal cells in the liver, bile ducts, for example, the thyroid, which produces and delivers hormones to the body, mammary glands, salivary glands, other kinds of glands, the bronchioles, and here are the kidney tubules. Simple columnar epithelium has a larger surface area. Yeah, so they're vertically oriented, extending into the lumen of the digestive tract. So you'll find it in the GI tract, cuboidal, the uterus, the kidney, and the uterine tubes. And in the uterine tubes, they have cilia to move the egg down to the uterus. This is an example of villi. So these are extensions that extend into the gastrointestinal tract. In this case, the duodenum, which is part of the small intestine. All of these small cells here are columnar cells. Sometimes you can tell that the nuclei tend to be at the base of the columnar cell. One, singular, is called a villus. The function is to provide more surface area. And so this is the difference between the villi and the microvilli. The microvilli are extensions of each cell. I should write that down. Microvilli are plasma membrane extensions of each cell. And here you can also see goblet cells. And the function of the goblet cells is to excrete mucus. Other extensions of cells are cilia. They're longer than microvilli, and their function is different. It's not to absorb or excrete, rather, for the most part, the motile cilia is used to move particles. So you'll find them in the respiratory tract. What do you think that they move in the respiratory tract? You can write that in the chat if you like. In the uterus, they move the egg. What are we moving out of our respiratory tract that we're breathing in all the time? Mucus, yes. Yes, mucus with trapped particles. Excellent. So oxygen flows out due to differences in partial pressures of gases. Yeah. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue. For example, you'll find this in the esophagus. It does secrete some mucus, providing lubrication. The cells are replaced by underlying cells. There are some variations. This is stratified epithelial tissue in the oral cavity. Underlying it, as you would expect, underlying epithelial tissue is connective tissue. Loose connective tissue. Some cells are keratinized, some of the epithelial cells. So keratinized epithelial cells are a surface area of dead cells with keratin. Keratin is a kind of protein, and often the layer of dead cells, if you're looking at it under a microscope, is clear. Non-keratinized epithelial lacks that layer of dead cells. What is the purpose? It prevents water loss, protection from penetration of organisms like pathogens, bacteria, viruses. They don't penetrate the skin. And skin is very important to us. This is an alien in, I can't remember which version of Star Trek. Probably the Next Generation. I don't know. I don't remember. Okay, good. That brings us to the end of epithelial tissue. Oh, I didn't say, where do you find stratified squamous? We didn't say where you found stratified squamous, so we have to say that. So The tongue, for example, because your tongue is constantly being abraded by food. In the oral mucosa, the epithelial lining of the oral cavity, the esophagus, and the vagina. So on the surfaces where there's likely to be a lot of cells being sloughed off. There is also, oh no, I need to add a couple more before we finish here. Let me just add a page. Stratified cuboidal. There is stratified cuboidal tissue, epithelial tissue. They are the cuboidal cells that, for example, line the sweat glands. So they secrete sweat. They secrete hormones and produce sperm. So they're found in sweat gland ducts. They're found in ovarian follicles. They secrete many of your hormones during pregnancy, for example. And sperm is produced in seminiferous tubules in the testes. One last type of epithelial tissue, transitional. Transitional epithelium. Excuse me. It's multi-layered. It tends to be where tissue is stretched. So they flatten when tissue is stretched so that the tissue doesn't break. So you find it, for example, in the urinary tract, the kidney, the ureter, which is the tube that takes urine from the kidney to the bladder, and the bladder itself. All right, thus endeth our epithelial lecture. So let me stop there.